Today we are going to explore one of the most fascinating chapters in human history, the universe of medieval sea monsters, creatures that inhabited not only the depths of the oceans, but also the minds and hearts of the navigators who dared to set sail toward the unknown. Prepare yourself for a journey through the seas of the Middle Ages, where fear and wonder walked hand in hand with every wave that broke against the hulls of ships. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. Imagine a world where maps end abruptly at the edges of the ocean, where beyond the last known strip of land extended not just water, but the territory of the inexplicable. In the European Middle Ages, which span approximately from the 5th to the 15th century, the ocean was not simply a geographic space to be navigated and conquered. It was a metaphysical frontier, an abyss where the world of men dissolved into the realm of something infinitely larger and infinitely more dangerous than any known terrestrial threat. For medieval Europeans, the sea represented everything that human civilization could not control, name, or understand. The coasts were the limits of the familiar world, the point beyond which the rules of everyday life ceased to exist. And if the terrestrial world was already inhabited by wild creatures, predators, and dangers of all kinds, what could exist in that dark abyss, in those bottomless waters where sunlight barely reached and from where no man had ever returned to recount in detail what he had seen? The answer, built over centuries through sailors' accounts, religious texts, folkloric traditions, and scholarly works, was simple and terrifying: monsters. Creatures of colossal proportions, grotesque forms, and supernatural powers, which lurked in the depths and patiently awaited the moment when some daring ship would venture too far from safe shores. They were the guardians of the unknown ocean, and their myth ran through the entire Middle Ages like an invisible current that connected cultures, religions, and traditions separated by thousands of kilometers. To understand the depth of this fear, one must first understand how the men and women of the Middle Ages viewed the world around them. Medieval cosmography was profoundly different from our own. The world was generally represented in the so-called mappae mundi, maps of the world that reflected both the available geographic knowledge and the religious and philosophical beliefs of the time. They were not abstract representations. They were serious documents, constructed with care and consulted with reverence, that sought to represent the totality of creation as it was understood by that civilization. The most famous of these maps is the Hereford Mappa Mundi, produced in England around the year 1300 and preserved to this day in Hereford Cathedral in Wales. Standing over 1.5 meters tall, this extraordinary map places Jerusalem at the center of the world, representing the 3 known parts of the globe, Europe, Asia, and Africa, as a disk surrounded by a circular ocean. And at the edges of this ocean, where the familiar world ended and the unknown began, the map is filled with fantastic creatures, hybrid beings, animals of impossible proportions, and sea monsters of all kinds, drawn with a richness of detail that reveals just how seriously these beings were taken by those who depicted them. Another notable map is the Ebstorf map, created in Germany probably in the 13th century, which also incorporated fantastic creatures within its borders. These maps were not considered works of fantasy by those who produced or consulted them. The practice of illustrating unknown regions with monstrous creatures had very ancient roots. Since classical Greece, cartographers marked the limits of the known world with warnings about what might exist beyond. In the Middle Ages, this tradition was absorbed and amplified with an intensity that reflected the weight of the religious beliefs of the time. The famous Latin expression hic sunt dracones, which means here are dragons, appears on one of the oldest globes to have survived to our days, the so-called Lennox globe, produced around 1503, indicating regions of the world still unexplored by Europeans. In other maps, variations of this expression mark the edges of the ocean as territories of absolute danger. These cartographic monsters were not decorative ornaments, they were warnings. They were the visual language of uncertainty and danger, a way of communicating to navigators and scholars that those regions were not only unknown, but were dangerous in ways that escaped common understanding. Medieval sea monsters, however, were not born out of thin air. They had deep roots in much older traditions, both in the classical sources of the Greco-Roman world and in the sacred scriptures of Christianity. From antiquity, the Middle Ages inherited the encyclopedic weight of the work of Pliny the Elder, the Roman naturalist who lived in the 1st century of the Christian era and compiled in his monumental Historia Naturalis everything the ancient world knew, or believed it knew, about nature. Pliny described in rich detail sea creatures of all shapes and sizes, including beings of extraordinary proportions that inhabited the most distant oceans. For medieval scholars, who revered classical authors as unquestionable authorities, Pliny's descriptions carried almost the weight of a sacred text, but the religious weight was even deeper and more decisive. The Bible, the central text of Western medieval civilization, spoke explicitly of a monstrous being that inhabited the waters, the Leviathan. Described in the Book of Job and other Old Testament texts, the Leviathan was portrayed as a sea serpent of unimaginable power, a creature that only God could tame. In the Book of Job, chapter 41, the description is detailed and terrifying, a being whose breath set the air on fire, whose scales were impenetrable armor, whose eyes shone like the dawn and whose mouth exhaled flames and smoke. For medieval Christians, the Leviathan was not a poetic metaphor. It was a theological reality, a creature created by God as a symbol of the primordial chaos that preceded creation and that continued to exist in the depths of the ocean, waiting silently. The identification of the sea with chaos and the forces of evil was, therefore, deeply rooted in medieval theology. The ocean was the place where evil hid, where the forces of primordial disorder continued to exist, kept at bay by divine providence, but always ready to manifest against men who ventured too far. This belief was not a marginal superstition. It was part of the intellectual and spiritual fabric of medieval European civilization, shared by kings, popes, philosophers, and illiterate sailors with equal intensity. Among the texts that most influenced the medieval view of sea creatures, none was more powerful than the Physiologus. Originally composed in Greek, likely in Alexandria, Egypt, between the 2nd and 4th centuries of the Christian era, the Physiologus was a compilation of descriptions of real and fantastical animals, accompanied by moral and religious interpretations. Each creature was not only described in its physical attributes, but also interpreted as a symbol of a spiritual truth. One animal could be the incarnation of sin, another could be the image of virtue, and the reader was invited to see in the natural world a constant mirror of the eternal truths of the Christian cosmos. The Physiologus was translated into Latin and dozens of other languages throughout the Middle Ages, becoming one of the most read and copied texts of the entire era. From it, the medieval bestiaries were developed, elaborate illuminated works that described the animal world with a mixture of natural observation, classical tradition, and Christian symbolic interpretation. The bestiaries were at once natural encyclopedias, moral guides, and works of art, and their influence on the medieval imagination can hardly be overstated. Among the sea creatures described in the Physiologus and the bestiaries, the Aspidoquilone stood out, its name derived from Greek and suggesting something like asp turtle. The Aspidoquilone was described as a creature of such prodigious size that it could be mistaken for an island. Its shell was covered in sand and rocks, and trees and abundant vegetation grew upon it. Unwary sailors would land on its back, convinced they had found solid ground after weeks at sea, would light fires to cook and rest, and then the creature, feeling the heat of the flames upon its skin, would suddenly dive into the depths, dragging the unfortunate souls to the bottom of the ocean. It was a death that came disguised as salvation, a trap cloaked as a refuge. The story of the Aspidoquilone became one of the most popular tales of the Middle Ages and proliferated in countless variants throughout Europe and the Orient. In the Arab world, a similar creature was known as the Zaratan, described as a floating island that swallowed entire ships. In the Islamic tradition, the Zaratan resurfaces in the stories of Sinbad the Sailor, one of the most famous narratives of the 1001 Nights. In the British Isles, similar versions of the story circulated in Gaelic languages. The universality of this tale reflects something profound about the human fear of the ocean. The land that seems solid can be a deadly trap, and what seems safe can be the prelude to the most absolute destruction. No medieval text combined the experience of navigation with the encounter with the marvelous as vividly as the Navigatio Sancti Brendani, the navigation of St. Brendan, likely written in the 9th century and based on much older Irish traditions. St. Brendan was a 6th century Irish monk, considered one of the great saints of the Celtic Church, and his supposed voyage across the Atlantic in search of the promised land of the saints became one of the most fascinating and widely read stories of all European medieval literature. In the narrative, St. Brendan and his companions depart from the coasts of Ireland in a currach, a leather boat typical of the Irish navigators of the time, and spend 7 years wandering the North Atlantic in search of a sacred island. During this extraordinary journey, they encounter all sorts of wonders: islands of silent monks living in eternal contemplation, a gigantic bird that speaks the language of men, a crystal column in the middle of the ocean, and, most impressive of all encounters, a stop to celebrate Easter Mass on an island that reveals itself to be the back of a huge sea creature named Jasconius. The Jasconius episode echoes the tradition of the Aspidocalone, but with a crucial difference that reveals much about the medieval mentality. Instead of a deadly encounter, the St. Brendan narrative transforms the meeting with the sea monster into a sacred experience. Jasconius does not try to destroy the monks. It remains motionless while they celebrate their sacred rite, as if it recognized the presence of the divine. The ocean monster is domesticated by faith, transformed from a threat into an instrument of divine providence. For medieval readers, the message was clear. In the face of spiritual power, even the greatest horrors of the ocean bow down. The Navigatio Sancti Brendani circulated in over 100 medieval manuscripts and was translated into multiple European languages, including Anglo-Saxon, Old French, and various Germanic languages. Its influence on the imagination of medieval navigators and on the construction of the image of the Atlantic as an ocean of wonders and dangers was enormous and lasting, shaping the way generations of sailors thought about what they might find beyond the horizon. While the Irish monks imagined mystical encounters with sea giants, and European cartographers filled the edges of their maps with hybrid creatures, in Northern Europe, an equally rich and even more explicitly terrifying tradition flourished. The Norse peoples, who were some of the most adventurous and experienced navigators of the medieval world, developed a marine mythology of extraordinary richness. For them, the ocean was not just dangerous, it was literally inhabited by deities and monsters of cosmic scale, creatures whose existence was intertwined with the very destiny of the universe. Norse mythology placed Jörmungandr, the world serpent, son of Loki and brother of Fenrir and Hel, at the bottom of the sea. Jörmungandr was so immense that it encircled the entire circumference of the earth and bit its own tail, a circular symbol known as the Ouroboros that appeared in several cultures of the ancient world. In Norse mythology, the serpent would only let go of its tail at Ragnarok, the end of times, when it would emerge from the depths to wage the final combat against the god Thor, in a duel from which both would emerge dead. The ocean was therefore not just a dangerous place, it was the repository of the end of the world itself. But the most enduring and influential sea monster of the Norse tradition had a different nature than Jörmungandr. It was the Kraken. Described in the sagas and medieval Norse texts as an octopus or squid of simply unimaginable proportions, the Kraken was one of the most widely documented and discussed creatures of medieval Scandinavian literature. The word refers back to Old Norwegian and is related to the idea of something crooked or coiled, possibly a reference to the shape of the creature's tentacles, which uncoiled over the waters, like nightmares of flesh and muscle. The first written records of the Kraken appear in 13th century Norse texts. In the Örvarod's saga, one of the oldest Icelandic sagas to have reached us, there is mention of a creature of extraordinary proportions called Hafgufa, the sea vapor, which was so enormous that it could be mistaken for an island or solid ground. The text describes the Hafgufa as capable of swallowing entire ships, whales, and everything else it encountered in its path. The creature remained at the surface for long periods before submerging, and this moment of submersion created a whirlpool so powerful that it dragged everything around it into the depths. Over time, reports of the kraken became increasingly elaborate and detailed, accumulating in the memories of northern fishermen and sailors with the force of stories that are repeated because they always seem true. Fishermen from the northern coast of Norway described having sighted the creature, a dark mass emerging slowly from the depths, its tentacles stretching for dozens, perhaps hundreds of meters around the boat, before submerging again in a whirlpool that could drag any vessel into the abyss. Some accounts claimed that the kraken was so immense that when it emerged to the surface, it looked like an archipelago of rocky islands, and that fish gathered around it in such quantities that fishermen could fill their nets simply by sailing around the creature. Perhaps no work of the late Middle Ages and the early modern period contributed more to consolidating and spreading the image of sea monsters than the Carta Marina, produced by the Swedish ecclesiastic Olaus Magnus and published in Venice in the year 1539. This extraordinary map, which depicted the Nordic countries and the seas surrounding them, was at once a geographical work of great precision by the standards of the time and a visual catalogue of the monsters that, according to tradition, inhabited the waters of northern Europe. Olaus Magnus had been born in Sweden in 1490 and would be forced to exile himself from his country due to the transformations of the Protestant Reformation. During the years preceding his exile, he travelled extensively through northern Scandinavia, collecting knowledge, traditions, and accounts from the local populations. This immense material, gathered with the dedication of a man who knew he might never return to his homeland, would form the basis of his two great works. The Carta Marina is a document of inestimable historical value, but it is also a work of striking visual beauty, filled with elaborate images of marine creatures strategically positioned in the seas around Scandinavia. The map presents dozens of different creatures, colossal sea serpents that coil their bodies around ships' hulls, monsters with heads resembling those of land animals and bodies of fish, creatures resembling giant octopuses but with even more grotesque forms, and hybrid beings that combine characteristics of fish with those of animals that never lived in the sea. Each creature was positioned in a specific location on the map, suggesting that they were not generic figures, but descriptions of specific creatures that had been sighted in certain regions of the northern seas by reliable witnesses. Olaus Magnus elaborated further on these themes in his great literary work, the Historia de Gentibus Septentrionalibus, published in Rome in the year 1555. In this monumental work, divided into 22 books, he dedicated extensive sections to the creatures of the sea, including detailed descriptions of sea serpents of enormous proportions, monsters with varied forms, and the traditions of Nordic fishermen and sailors regarding the inhabitants of the depths. Olaus Magnus did not present these creatures as legends or myths, but as natural realities verified by reliable witnesses whom he had personally interviewed or whose accounts he had collected from reputable sources. The Carta Marina and the Historia de Gentibus Septentrionalibus circulated widely throughout the learned Europe of the 16th century and exerted an enormous influence on the perception of the Nordic seas in the following decades. For the naturalists and cartographers who came later, the work of Olaus Magnus was a source of authority on the creatures of the north, and many of the sea monsters that appear in maps and scientific works of the 16th and 17th centuries trace back directly to the images and descriptions he compiled with such dedication. The medieval imagination produced a true bestiary of marine creatures, each with its own characteristics, powers, and symbolic meanings. Beyond the biblical Leviathan and the Nordic kraken, a series of other creatures inhabited the pantheon of ocean monsters, each with its own tradition and its own territory, on the maps and in the texts of the time. The sea serpent was perhaps the most universally feared of all. Described in sources from virtually every medieval European maritime culture, the sea serpent appeared as a creature of impossible length, sometimes described as being hundreds of meters long, with scales as hard as stone, a head resembling that of a horse or a dragon, and the ability to coil its body around a ship and sink it as if it were made of paper. The descriptions varied in detail, but the essence was always the same: a marine reptile of catastrophic proportions that could destroy any vessel it encountered, driven not by hunger, but by a primordial hostility toward everything that existed above the waters. The Xiphias, described in medieval bestiaries of diverse origins, was a creature with characteristics reminiscent of a giant swordfish, but with dimensions and ferocity far greater than any known animal. The name possibly derives from the Latin Ziphius, which meant swordfish, but the creature of the bestiaries was far beyond any real animal. It was described as being capable of splitting ship hulls in half with its sharp snout and pursuing vessels with relentless speed and determination. The Serra, another creature from medieval texts, was described as a fish of enormous dimensions, endowed with membranous wings and a serrated dorsal crest so sharp that it could cut sails and masts with a simple graze. Texts claimed that the Serra would follow vessels for long distances before attacking them, like a predator, studying its prey before acting. The Physeter, whose name derived from the Greek meaning the one that blows, was a creature described as a gigantic whale with aggressive behavior, capable of expelling columns of water with enough force to flood and sink ships. Some medieval sources described the Physeter as possessing a huge mouth that could swallow entire boats, most likely inspired by real observations of sperm whales or humpback whales, distorted and amplified by oral tradition over generations. To understand why sea monsters held such power over the minds of medieval navigators, one must imagine what it was like to sail in that era with the means available. Medieval vessels were small, built with limited techniques, and subject to all the whims of the sea. A sudden storm could tear them apart in a matter of hours. A navigational error could leave crews without fresh water days away from any coast. Scurvy, caused by a vitamin C deficiency during prolonged diets at sea, decimated sailors on long voyages, producing terrifying symptoms such as darkening and bleeding gums, loss of teeth, stiffening of joints, and spontaneous bleeding under the skin. On the high seas, far from any visible land, the men who navigated the medieval oceans were completely alone with the elements. There was no way to call for help. There was no way to know with absolute certainty where they were. They depended on the stars, the wind, the currents, and an experience accumulated over generations to guide their vessels. And when the fog descended or the clouds covered the sky for days on end, total disorientation could set in within a few hours, transforming experienced men into beings lost in an immensity without references. In this context of extreme vulnerability, rumors about sea monsters were not merely tavern tales. They were a system for explaining the world. When a ship was wrecked under seemingly favorable conditions, when a crew vanished without a trace, when a sailor spotted something at sea they could not identify, the most readily available and culturally accepted explanation was that of a monster. Sea monsters gave a name to the inexplicable, humanizing the chaos of the ocean by transforming it into an adversary with definite shape and intent. However terrifying that shape and intent might be, the rituals and superstitions of medieval sailors reflected this universe of fear and belief. Not speaking certain words while pointing at the sea, not whistling on board for fear of summoning dangerous winds, not carrying certain objects on the ship, performing religious ceremonies before setting sail, making vows to patron saints of sailors such as Saint Nicholas and Saint Clement. All of this was part of a complex system of protection against the dangers of the ocean, among which sea monsters occupied a terrifying place. The stories that sailors brought back to port fueled a continuous cycle of collective fear and fascination. A sailor who claimed to have sighted a colossal sea serpent off the coast of Norway was heard with attention and respect by his peers, and his account was incorporated into the body of collective knowledge regarding the dangers of the sea. This account was then retold, enriched, distorted, and amplified each time it changed mouths, until the creature sighted grew in size and ferocity with every new version, as if the monsters themselves fed on the words used to describe them. The tradition of medieval sea monsters was not exclusive to Christian Europe. In the Islamic world, which from the 8th to the 13th centuries produced some of the most talented navigators and geographers in human history, there existed a rich parallel tradition of supernatural sea creatures that inhabited the frontiers of the known ocean. Arab navigators who crossed the Indian Ocean from the coasts of Arabia and Persia to the islands of Southeast Asia and the eastern coasts of Africa accumulated an immense body of nautical knowledge, and along with this knowledge traveled stories of creatures from the depths. Medieval Arab geographers, such as Al-Idrisi, who produced one of the most sophisticated maps of the 12th century at the court of the Norman king Roger II of Sicily, blended precise geographical observation with accounts of extraordinary creatures. For these authors, as for their European counterparts, the boundary between the natural and the supernatural was far more porous than we are accustomed to conceiving today. In the medieval Arab imagination, the Atlantic Ocean was called Bahr al-Zulmat, the Sea of Darkness, and was considered practically impassable. It was believed that beyond certain points in the ocean, there were creatures so powerful that they would not allow ships to pass, and that winds and currents of a supernatural nature would send back any vessel that dared to advance too far. This belief was not much different from what European sailors believed about the same seas, revealing how the fear of the ocean depths was a truly universal experience. It would be a mistake, however, to think that all medieval accounts of sea monsters were pure invention, without any foundation in reality. Behind many of the most persistent and detailed of these reports were real animals, creatures that medieval sailors and fishermen effectively encountered at sea but lacked the conceptual or scientific means to correctly identify and classify. Nature, as so often happens, outdid the imagination, and the men of the Middle Ages did what they could to understand what they saw with the tools available to them. The most notable correspondence between myth and reality concerns the kraken itself. The giant squid, known scientifically as Architeuthis dux, is one of the largest invertebrates on the planet. The largest recorded specimens can reach lengths of up to 13 meters, including the tentacles, and weigh hundreds of kilograms. These creatures live in the depths of the ocean, generally below 300 meters deep, and rarely reach the surface. But when they do, or when their bodies wash up on beaches after death, the effect on those who witness them is inevitably stunning. A medieval sailor who sighted a giant squid emerging from the sea or colossal tentacles moving slowly beneath the surface had every reason in the world to believe they were facing something supernatural. The colossal sea serpent, in turn, may have been inspired by several different animals, each contributing its own elements to the composite creature that inhabited the nightmares of navigators. The oarfish, known scientifically as Regalicus glesne, is the longest bony fish in the world, capable of reaching lengths of up to 11 meters. With its flattened, silvery body, its long, bright red dorsal fins, and its ability to swim both vertically and horizontally near the ocean's surface, the oarfish is exactly the type of creature that could easily be mistaken for a sea serpent by a surprised sailor catching a brief glimpse of it. The basking shark, known as Catorhinus maximus, may have contributed to sea serpent myths in an entirely different way. When this huge shark, which can reach 12 meters in length, dies and its body begins to decompose at sea or on a beach, the shape that remains after the flesh deteriorates and the cartilaginous head separates can surprisingly resemble that of a serpent or a long-necked creature, completely different from the original shape of the living animal. Modern researchers call these decomposed remains pseudo-plesiosaurs, and they were certainly responsible for some of the most convincing medieval reports of sea monsters found on beaches or floating in the ocean. The sperm whale, the largest toothed whale on the planet, is another obvious candidate for the origin of various myths. With its straight, square snout, its enormous teeth, and its often aggressive behavior when threatened or injured, the sperm whale could well have seemed like a monster to fishermen who encountered it unexpectedly at sea. There are historical records of sperm whales that attacked and sank vessels, and these incidents, passed down orally over time, certainly fueled reports of aggressive and destructive sea monsters. The narwhal, a small Arctic cetacean endowed with a single spiral tooth that can reach 3 meters in length, fueled in turn a different myth, not of a destructive sea monster, but of a supernatural wonder. Narwhal tusks sold by sailors and merchants were presented as unicorn horns, the so-called alicorn, and were worth their weight in gold for their supposed magical and medicinal properties. Kings and popes paid fortunes for these objects, unaware that they originated from a completely real animal that inhabited the cold northern seas, with all the normalcy of a species well adapted to its environment. Walruses, with their prominent tusks and territorial behavior, gave rise to accounts of threatening hybrid creatures. Manatees and dugongs, glimpsed from afar by weary sailors, generated the persistent myths of mermaids, half-human, half-fish creatures that lured navigators to their deaths. The vampire squid, giant octopuses, abyssal fish with their grotesque forms and bioluminescent lights, all this real fauna, seen fragmentarily and without scientific context, completed the cast of animals that medieval imagination transformed into monsters. As the Middle Ages progressed toward the Age of Discovery in the 14th and 15th centuries, accounts of sea monsters did not disappear. On the contrary, they multiplied and diversified with every new expedition that pushed into unknown territories, as if the horizon always receded a little further, taking the monsters along to new, unexplored seas. Christopher Columbus, in the logbook of his first voyage in 1492, records sightings of marine creatures he could not identify with certainty. In one entry, he describes what appeared to be mermaids, but notes with a certain disappointment that they were not as beautiful as they were said to be. They were most likely manatees that the Genoese navigator had spotted in Caribbean waters. The fact that Columbus, one of the most experienced and pragmatic navigators of his time, was looking for mermaids during his historic voyage to the West is deeply illustrative of the depth with which beliefs in supernatural creatures had penetrated even the most practical minds of the explorers. Ferdinand Magellan, during the first circumnavigation of the globe carried out between 1519 and 1522, and his crew recorded sightings of strange creatures at different points of the epic journey. The coasts of South America, the islands of the Pacific, the turbulent waters near the southern tip of the American continent, all these regions generated reports of unknown animals that were interpreted in light of the available cultural categories, and these categories inevitably included the sea monsters of medieval tradition that the sailors had learned about since childhood. The persistence of reports of sea monsters throughout the Age of Discovery is a significant historical fact. It was not just the less experienced sailors who believed in them, it was also the officers, the seasoned pilots, and the captains hardened by decades of navigation. The cultural universe in which these people had grown up was a universe in which sea monsters were accepted realities, and this belief shaped what they saw, or believed they saw, when they ventured beyond known shores. However, even in the Middle Ages, beliefs in sea monsters were not universally accepted without question. Over the centuries, some thinkers and naturalists began to apply a more rigorous critique to reports of supernatural creatures, not necessarily denying their existence, but seeking to understand them within a more rational and systematic framework than that of the traditional compilations. Albertus Magnus, the great Dominican theologian and naturalist of the 13th century, one of the most brilliant intellectuals of the entire Middle Ages, devoted considerable attention to the study of animals in his vast work, De Animalibus. For Albertus, the study of nature was a way of knowing God's creation, and this required careful observation and rigorous reasoning, not merely the uncritical acceptance of received traditions, however venerable they might be. In the 15th century, Cardinal Pierre d'Ailly, in his geographical work Imago Mundi, read with attention by the young Cristoforo Colombo, discussed the existence of extraordinary creatures with a balance between respect for tradition and controlled skepticism. These sketches of questioning, still timid, prepared the ground for the more profound transformations that would come with the Renaissance and the scientific revolution of the following centuries. The Swiss naturalist Conrad Gessner published between 1551 and 1558 his monumental Historia Animalium, a multi-volume encyclopedia that sought to systematically catalogue all known animals. His work is at once a repository of medieval traditions regarding sea monsters and an example of a new and more critical approach to the issue of marine fauna. Gessner reproduced the descriptions of fantastic creatures, but often accompanied them with skeptical observations or notes on the difficulty of verifying eyewitness accounts, introducing a degree of methodical doubt that was new to the field. The 17th century brought even more decisive progress. The English philosopher Francis Bacon argued that genuine knowledge must be based on observation and experiment, not on tradition and authority. This ideal created an intellectual environment in which the mere assertion of ancient authorities was increasingly insufficient to establish the existence of a creature. In the 18th century, the Norwegian bishop Erik Pontoppidan in his Historia Naturalis Norvegiae, published in 1752, still included extensive discussions about the kraken and the sea serpent as real creatures, yet seeking sources and evidence with a new rigor. Paradoxically, by attempting to treat the kraken as a natural animal subject to scientific observation, Pontoppidan unknowingly contributed to the process that would eventually reveal its true nature. The development of zoology as a rigorous scientific discipline, with the taxonomy system developed by the Swedish naturalist Carl von Linné as a foundation, created a framework in which each creature could be classified, described, and studied in a systematic manner. And with this framework came the possibility of verifying, one by one, the creatures of the bestiaries and medieval maps, separating the real animal from the fantastic embellishments that tradition had deposited upon it over the centuries. Some of the most emblematic creatures of medieval myths revealed themselves to have extraordinary real correspondences. The giant squid, for example, was finally confirmed as a real species only at the end of the 19th century, when the first complete specimens were caught or found on the beaches of the North Atlantic. The oarfish was identified and classified. The sperm whale was studied in detail by naturalists and whalers. These real animals, now named and classified within the modern scientific system, revealed the core of zoological reality that had fueled centuries of myth and terror. In the 20th century, deep-sea cameras and research submarines revealed an abyssal fauna of a richness and strangeness that medieval men could never have imagined, even in their most elaborate nightmares. Fish with transparent teeth, creatures with gelatinous bodies, squid of unexpected forms inhabiting the deepest zones of the ocean. The real world of the depths proved to be, in many respects, as extraordinary as the medieval bestiaries had intuited, albeit in ways completely different from those they had imagined. The colossal squid, known scientifically as Mesonychoteuthis hamiltoni, is even larger than the giant squid and was only recognized as a species at the beginning of the 20th century. Estimates based on captured specimens suggest it can reach lengths of up to 14 meters, with eyes that can exceed 30 centimeters in diameter, the largest in the animal kingdom. In 2023, researchers exploring the depths of the Pacific Ocean with remotely operated underwater vehicles documented specimens of squid and other invertebrates whose species were completely unknown to science. The ocean still holds secrets. The legacy of medieval sea monsters would be reduced to almost nothing if we saw it only as a story of overcoming fear through reason. Their real impact on human culture is much richer and more complex than a simple narrative of scientific progress. Medieval sea monsters left a deep mark on the literature, art, and cultural imagination of the Western world that endures in surprising ways to this day. The tradition of the kraken reverberated directly in the literature of the following centuries. The creature appears in poems by the English poet Alfred Lord Tennyson in the 19th century, in novels by Julio Verne, such as 20,000 leguas submarinas, published in 1870. And today it is ubiquitous in popular culture, from Hollywood film productions to video games and television series with global reach. The biblical Leviathan lent its name to the great political treatise by the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes, published in 1651, where it became a metaphor for the sovereign state as a creature of absolute power over its citizens. The influence of the medieval monster on modern political thought is one of the most unexpected echoes of this tradition. Herman Melville, in his monumental novel Moby Dick, published in 1851, took up the tradition of sea monsters to create one of the most profound works of world literature. Melville's white whale is at once a real animal and a symbol of all the mystery, horror, and fascination that the ocean has always exerted over the human imagination. The origins of this tradition lie directly in the monsters that inhabited medieval maps and texts, in the stories sailors told upon returning from the northern seas, in the creatures that Olaus Magnus drew in his Carta Marina with such richness of detail. H.P. Lovecraft, in the 20th century, created in Cthulhu a sea monster that faithfully captured the medieval feeling of cosmic terror before the depths of the ocean, an entity sleeping at the bottom of the sea whose very existence threatened the sanity of the mortals who beheld it. It is impossible not to recognize in this creature the direct echoes of those that inhabited medieval maps. There is something profoundly human in the fear of medieval sea monsters that deserves to be recognized without condescension. It was not merely superstition or ignorance, although superstition and ignorance certainly played their roles. It was also the expression of an appropriate response to a genuinely terrifying environment. The medieval ocean was dangerous in very concrete ways: storms without warning, diseases that decimated crews, disorientation that could be fatal, and drowning that was quick and unwitnessed. And it was unknown in profound ways that were not merely relative to the state of available knowledge. Faced with this immense unknown, human imagination did what it always does more efficiently than any other tool. It filled the void with shapes. It gave a face to fear. It created characters for the enemy. It transformed chaos into narrative. Medieval sea monsters were, in this sense, not just objects of terror but also cognitive tools, ways to make the unbearable understandable, the incomprehensible nameable, and the terrifying, in some way, faceable. Naming the monster was a way of exerting some control over it, even if that control was only narrative. Sailors who set out to sea knowing that colossal creatures lurked in the depths did not stop sailing because of it. They continued to set sail, they continued to explore, they continued to push the boundaries of the known world, even in the face of a fear that was not abstract, but concrete and culturally legitimized by centuries of religious, philosophical, and literary tradition. And it was precisely this courage, this willingness to face the ocean filled with monsters, that produced the age of discovery, the expansion of the known world, the connection between continents previously completely isolated from one another, and, eventually, the discovery that the ocean, however rich in extraordinary creatures it might be, was not the realm of supernatural evil that medieval bestiaries described. The monsters gradually disappeared from maps, replaced by increasingly precise coastlines and increasingly familiar place names. But the fascination with the ocean, the respect for its depths, and the awareness that it still holds secrets yet to be discovered remained, and remain to this day. In 2023, scientists estimate that about 80% of the ocean floor has not yet been mapped in detail. The abyssal depths remain one of the least explored environments on the planet, inhabited by creatures that science has not yet fully catalogued. And perhaps this is the most lasting legacy of medieval sea monsters, not the specific terror they caused, not the serpents and giant octopuses drawn on the edges of maps, but the essential humility they taught all who contemplated them. The reminder that the world is bigger, stranger, and more wonderful than any map can contain. The intuition that the ocean holds lives of a diversity and strangeness that human imagination, however fertile it may be, will never be able to fully anticipate. The medieval sailors were right about that, even when they were wrong about everything else. The ocean holds surprises, it always has. If this journey through the depths of the medieval imagination has awakened in you the same curiosity that led these brave men to set sail toward the unknown, then you already know what to do. Dive into the comments below and tell us which creature from this bestiary most captured your imagination, whether it was the colossal kraken of the Nordic seas, the ingenious Aspedoquiloni of the bestiaries, the terrible leviathan of the sacred scriptures, or some other creature that today sleeps only on the pages of medieval manuscripts. Share this documentary with someone who also has the courage to navigate through such stories. And if you are not yet part of this crew, subscribe to the channel now. There are many other oceans of history waiting for you, and the monsters in the next documentaries are just as extraordinary as those we encountered today. Until the next voyage.